Well, hi everyone. Thanks for joining. And let me take a moment, first of all, to mention our highly successful recent event commemorating 90 years since the Thessaloniki events of 1936. All the videos have been uploaded on our YouTube channel. You can find them on a special playlist we created. And on top of that, let me also announce that a book based on the findings of this event is in preparation and will be published in due course. Back to today's session, let me welcome Mario Diani. In the original plan was to hold today's seminar last January in person. And quite frankly, we should have, since Mario was in Athens at the time, giving his graduate seminar, this superb graduate seminar. Exceptional circumstances, however, always have their way, so they messed things up back then, and Mario will now be talking to us online. Perhaps that's not such a bad thing, after all, as the screen forces us to focus squarely on the arguments. Now, as everybody knows, Mario is an old and valued friend of the laboratory. So when I put together the introduction to tonight's seminar, I decided to be a bit provocative by framing his presentation not just as another data-heavy talk, but as an opportunity, perhaps to touch base with the very roots of our discipline, which is why I mentioned Lawrence von Stein, a fascinating and a bit paradoxical figure. Uh, Lawrence von Stein was a 19th century conservative jurist who both influenced Marx, as it is believed, even though Marx never cited him directly. And quite ironically, if you think about it, was the first one, the one who gave us the term social movement, soziale Bewegung. Writing in the 1840s, Stein wasn't just looking at activism. He was looking at a particular structural clash. And this is how he approached social movements as extra institutional, of course, protest by the subaltern, but not any and all protest, but protest of a specific kind, protest demanding social rights. And in that sense, a social movement isn't just a group of people with banners or nowadays a hashtag. It is a category defined by the identity of the actors, the unconventional, non-institutionalized character of their protest, and the transformative nature of their goals. Um, so in that sense, for Stein, if a woman lacked any one of these features, it was simply not a social movement. Now, I bring Stein up because Mario, with his own networks perspective, is one of the very few scholars I know who shares this obsession with getting our categories right. So in that sense, we both, I think, belong to that school of thought that believes that if your concepts are fuzzy, uh, the findings are bound to be hollow. Which leads me to another patron saint of laboratory, Giovanni Sartori. You may have seen that in the invitation that I mentioned the nightmare of pseudo-categories, an offshoot of the craze to increase our concepts' traveling potential across continents and across decades. So in that spirit, it is not rare nowadays to see the term social movement being used to describe things as dissimilar as radical grassroots collectives, professionalized NGOs, even state-funded service providers. But Sartori's warning was clear in that respect. He said that when you increase a concept's extension, its traveling potential, that says, without minding its intention, the properties it includes, you don't get broader signs, you get thinner signs. You end up with concept stretching. And I'm mentioning all this because throughout his career, Mario has always been an enthusiast of conceptual analysis, never concerned with lazy definitions. Whether mapping networks in Glasgow and Bristol, or as in today's presentation, bridging social movement and civil society research through the lens of alternative action organization, the AAOs, in the Mediterranean periphery. An issue, I think, which addresses precisely the relationship between social movement organizations and NGOs. And as I'm also doing the commentary, I will say no more at this point. So Mario, welcome back, even if virtually. We're ready to have the data you're going to be presenting, but more importantly, I think we're also ready for the conceptual challenge. So thank you once again for your friendship, and I give you the floor, the screen really.
Yeah,
and I will
thanks
stop
very
here.
much. Thank you. Thank you. Can I see the screen, the
Go ahead.
presentation? Because I'm not seeing it right now. And apparently it was working so nice until a few minutes ago.
It will patience. There you go. There you go.
It's coming up. Apparently. No.
Can't you see it? See it?
No. Wait a sec. Wait a sec now. I assumed tech and control, but this time control doesn't seem to be operating, which is bizarre. But let me to think.
If you want to start, then I can help with the presentation and whatever.
Probably. Mm. Oh yeah, let me figure out. I was probably too fast. Let's
If
see.
you can take control now, can you do it now?
Exactly. You'll be able to do it now. Okay, can you see?
What on?
Can you see, guys? Yes, sir. Good.
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. Sorry. Okay, good. Yes, thanks very much. I think Seraphim is always too generous. You're always very flattering with your introductions. I'm not sure if the expectations raised will be met anyway. Yeah, at one level, there is an issue. In my work, I always try to play between the importance of categories and the importance of relation. One of my points has been that trying to clarify that very often, most of the times, we look at political phenomena, collective action, in terms of the categorical properties of the actors involved. So we built assumptions about the nature of what represent a typical social movement organization, for example. And then we derive the characteristics of the phenomenon from the average properties, the distribution of the characteristics of these actors that we have associated with a certain particular category. So we assume that there are social movement organizations, and we look on them to identify the property of their collective phenomena. And I always try to suggest that instead it's better to start without assumptions on the categorical properties of the actors, instead looking at who is actually working, cooperating with in specific instances of collective action, and then figure out from there, derive from there, the characteristics of the phenomenon taken as a whole. In this particular presentation, we might end up there, but I take one step backward, and I start thinking, looking at characteristics of some different organizational types that we often associate with civil society in general on the one hand, and more specifically with the political activism on the other hand, and to see if they have developed or come closer these characteristics over time, or better, if the characteristics of organizations established at different points in time suggest some kind of homogenization rather than, or instead of growing differentiation between them. And as you can see, it's the paper is actually, the presentation, the responsibility for the moment is on me primarily. Then Angelos Loukakis and Maria Kouzis are not responsible for any mistakes I done in the analysis, but their name is there because the data and about which I am going to talk actually were collected by them in an earlier project in which Maria in particular played a key role, and also hopefully this will become at a later stage some kind of a paper, but for the time being they take the merit and the credit for the data, and I take responsibility for the mistakes. Now, what was the starting point for this? The starting point for this is a broader argument about the relationship between civil society and social movement. Very often, it is kind of we've seen analysis of this relationship in terms of a sort of a linear logic, suggesting a step from a move from one particular condition to another one, and actually the relationship is being thought of in both ways. I mean, on the one hand, very often we have seen analysis suggest implying a relationship between movement organizations and civil society, in particular in the organizational forms, from movement organization to associations, in terms of the polarity between radical and institutional politics, for example. Very often we have seen the thought of change, on transformation in terms of the emergence at particular points in time, during particular phases of active in high level of contention of new organizations, mostly informal, mostly focused on radical strategies, and then at a later stage, the transformation of these organizations into phenomena of a different kind, more formalized associations, more moderate associations, and associations less inclined to adopt radical styles of action. So, classic pattern of institutionalization, of radicalization, from radicalization to institutionalization. On other occasions, however, we have also very often come across in the literature in the opposite, across the opposite path. Namely, the possibility that at some point, some crucial points in time, civic organization, namely, I mean, more formalized, more or less bureaucratic, moderate types of associations might actually transform themselves, get closer to the characteristics that we normally associate with movement activist organizations. And for example, this actually can be seen, for example, in the starting phases quite frequently of a cycle of protest, in the starting phases of a major wave of protest. One obvious example would be for example, the civil Taro spoke about that, about dynamic, for example, in his book, Democracy and Disorder, on the 1981, about the 1965-1975 protest cycle in Italy. And he made, for example, the case of what usually used to be a fairly bureaucratic organization, actually a Union of Italian Women's, Unione Donne Italiane, which was an association very close to the Communist Party at the time, and how it got transformed into characteristics, became more open also in terms of membership and more radical in terms of action styles of action, and ended up being closer to what we would associate with the standard social movement organization because of the new political phase, the characteristics of the new political phase, and the greater collective effervescence that was being experienced in Italy in the late 60s. So in this case, there would be an opposite pattern from civic associations to movements. Another obvious example would be the civil rights movement in the States in the 60s, when it developed. It also brought with it the radicalization of fairly standard civil society organization, churches or civil rights groups. Anyway, now what is the idea from which this discussion starts? Was actually a paper by Donatella Della Porta that she published a few years ago in Voluntas, and in that paper the general framework, the relationship between civil society movements, in particular the relationship between social movement organizations and civil society organizations. These are the acronyms that I will refer to. And she suggested basically a double tap, two-directional change. One pointing towards the growing moderation of social movement organization, getting close to NGOs, but also on the other hand, an opposite pattern, suggesting that typical activist groups might have a general tendency to become closer, more similar to standard civil society organizations. So there will be, in this sense, a tendency to greater homogeneity of styles, and this would take the forms of the moderation of repertoires as opposed to direct action or on the part of NGOs, a slightly greater availability to actually engage in indirect action themselves. They will be in a different balance between more formalized organizational structures versus more informal ones. It could be measured also in terms of the frames used with the social movements being perhaps keener on placing greater emphasis, let's say, in their frames on transformation, impact on lifestyles, and transformation of also growing interest in service delivery or changing living conditions rather than in alterations in political power. And on the other hand, civil society organization being more interested in the opposite. So the idea Now the idea came to me that we might using, I think, one project that and one concept that Maria Cruz elaborated, the idea of alternative action organizations that she elaborated in a project, the so-called Live What project that took place in the previous decade, so to speak. And they collected data in 9 European countries, and they didn't really address the whole range of potential political organizations. They looked in particular organizations that were facing from different angles the situation of the deep social crisis, the dispossession, the grievances that had been generated by the great economic crisis that started in 2008 and then that developed in full force in the following years. No? So these organizations could, in many ways, so they mapped in different countries what we could define as a sort of a field, sets of organizations that were promoting collective events, carrying out alternatives to dominant socio-economic and cultural practices, addressing the visible beneficiaries, and making claims of the economic and social well-being. So that was the kind of definition of the organization that they produced. And I think the data set they collected about 500 organizations for each country. I think in this regard it was very interesting. I mean, it fits nicely the kind of questions that Donatella wanted to was referring at in her paper, because they combine quite different types of organizations. Some of them, and in bold here you see the ones which are mostly represented in the sampling. Some of them had to do with cooperatives, also organizations like time banks, voluntary non-profit organizations, and all sorts of, and other different range of community and also community groups, cultural and related and religious groups, professional groups, etc. And then there was another bunch of organizations they contacted who were far more close to the standard protest organization, or if you want to use SMO, civil social movement organization model, protest groups, informal citizens, so grassroots solidarity initiatives and networks, and etc. So there was quite a range of, I would say, a high range of diversity that enabled to test some hypotheses in that regard. This was, in particular, I decided to focus on 3 countries that, for the sake of a relative, let's say, at least sticking to countries with are supposed to share, for all the differences, a relative similar model of welfare, at least according to Esping Anderson, and that these were in particular Greece, Italy, and Spain, and on which I have a very variable level of expertise, and that's why your comments will be particularly helpful. So this is the distribution very, very close between civil society organizations and civic activists, or SMOs, as you prefer. Unfortunately, the tables are not so nice. And very basic differences between the very little differences actually between in this regard between the countries. And also, I decided to, of course, technically speaking, these data are not ideal to discuss issues of change, because we don't have, these were all collected at the same point in time. So take this type of conversation as a preliminary exercise rather than meant to explore some possible variations. Here, the element of variation is not given by the monitoring of the evolution of specific organizations, of course, but it's somehow it's approximated, so to speak, by looking at the date of in which the period in which the organizations that they sampled were actually established. Before actually here is before 1991, namely the choice of 91, maybe before, let's say, the start, the end of the phases, which was the most conducive, if you want, to the emergence of new social movements, etc. Then the period 91 to 2008, and then after that, after 2008, and namely after organizations established after the crisis. Okay, these are the pattern of for the three countries. We only have a very limited number of civic activist groups or SMOs before, which are still operating and which were established before 91, which is not surprising, and the highest concentration of SMOs is actually among organizations established after 2008. The assumption, and I concede that it is a strong assumption, is that somehow there will be some kind of path dependency effect, whereby that once organizations have taken a certain characteristic, it's unlikely that they will change massively over time. So by differentiating between phases, we should be able to see if the characteristics of groups established at different points in time are somehow significantly different. Of course, there is an element that to be taken into account, that it's more likely to have organizations which are little formalized, and which among those established in the last period considered, namely after 2008. This is not so surprising. It's not so granted, however, that even those organizations should necessarily assume and adopt more radical form patterns of action, which is possibly the most important element to consider. Anyway, this is the distribution of organization in the different periods. And let me, I would say, I will go through them. I will not comment on them because it will be by far endless. I keep it. I just leave a few seconds for each slide, so that people that might be listening to the talk later on can at least figure out, give a quick look at each table or spot. So I won't jump straight through the summary. But when it comes to the summarizing the general pattern in that regard, you will notice there are some things to note in anyway, namely that, for example, there is a difference. This is a difference which will stay on, which will come across several times during the talk, about the patterns in Greece and the patterns in Greece and Spain, and the patterns in Italy. In Italy, a huge proportion of even civic activist groups were founded before. Where in Greece and in Spain, there is a much higher proportion of civic activist organizations founded after the crisis, in particular in Greece, but also in Spain. And in Spain, what was remarkable was that before 1991, none of the organizations that were explored in Spain had actually been established before 1991. Fundamentally, and this is a point which I like to keep in mind, and we come back again, I think, is actually the main hypothesis I have so far. The pattern seems to be, there are two possible elements to consider. One is the fact that in comparative terms, Italy seems to have been less dramatically affected by the crisis than Greece, of course, but also Spain. On the other hand, what this suggests is that Italy had an activist sector engaged on those very issues, which are already there in place, at least since the new social movement of the 1990s, namely before the the crisis started, and possibly at least with the stronger level of consolidation and the institutionalization than in other countries. So apparently we had, at least what this suggests, this seems to suggest there was a set of organizations already there before, which had somehow managed to consolidate themselves and therefore were able to operate also later. Now, regarding the repertoires of action, I summarize them in four terms, in four different types of categories. One, protest activity, standard pressure, standard lobbying activity, communication means activities meant at changing, transforming, changing the people's perception of issues, changing their broader cultural approaches, and finally, alternative lifestyles focuses more on the experimentation of these styles, of particular alternative prefigurative practices as they might be defined. Now, in that regard, these are details of the specific elements that I use to build this scale of attention to alternative lifestyles. But okay, we can skip to pretty standard practices linked to community production, community gardens, alternative transport, fair trade, boycott, etc. Now, okay, this could be all the scale were we converted in on a 0-100 scale, and what comes out first of all is that countries were different, and considering what I said earlier, Italy altogether was the least protest-oriented sector, whereas Spain in particular was high, Greece was about the average. Not going ahead. Yes, it is. Okay. Generally speaking, unsurprising, propensity to protest raised among organizations established after 2008, the more recent one. And however, the protest repertoire among civil society organizations actually was weaker in the last phase than before, against the expectation. And on the other hand, if you get the best, and among social movement organizations, instead, again, the organization established, there had been a rise from the second, not so recent organization and the most recent ones, but actually the activist organizations were most active, if among those who had been founded active at least for a couple of decades. So in this regard, let's try to skip to the conclusion. There was no sign that civil society NGOs type of organization were more inclined to use protest, but on the other hand, civil social movement organizations seem to be, let's say, less inclined by comparison to the oldest one, the most recent one. So in this regard, and it was actually the organization established between 91 and 2000, therefore before the crisis, where the differences were smaller. So no clear story. Skipping to the communication repertoire, no major differences across phases, and I go straight to the conclusions in that regard. The thing is, was that Greek organizations were significantly more engaged than others with this particular type of repertoire, and it was also the most used repertoire across organizations coming from any period. There was no sign that social movement organizations were changing, were relying more on communication rather than other forms of protest. It was very high altogether, regardless of when they had been established. But on the other hand, again, civil society organizations, the more moderate, supposedly moderate ones, were actually less inclined, if established recently, than organizations from previous periods. So, which is again, to some extent, difficult to interpret because you would expect organizations that are in principle or should be in principle reluctant to use protest to be more inclined to use persuasive type of communication strategies, but instead this doesn't seem to be the case. Pressure was very limited in every country, so again, there was no evidence that lobbying was particularly used, and there was in any particular massive way. There was no particular sign in that regard that inclination to protest had gone. What could be said, however, and this might be in line with the thesis that the two different organizational styles had become more similar, was that ultimately civil society organizations had become even less inclined to use lobbying than before. So there been, in this sense, there have been a growing approximation, growing similarity, possibly because some of the more traditional NGO type of groups have become even less willing to interested in engaging in traditional lobbying. But yet again, this was a repertoire was very, very limited across the board. Lifestyle was more interested, and it showed greater variation. Again, the story. There were quite strong differences between countries, and yet again, it's quite revealing, I think, that the countries which were mostly in the types of organizations that were mostly interested in this were the ones established between 1901 and 2008. And these were the years in which it appeared that, say, new social movements were going to consolidate. It was a phase in which there was a certain sort of optimism. Okay, it had been already shattered by the let's say, post-Seattle and Genoa development in 2001, but there was still the idea that civil society was expanding and it might be consolidated. And I think it's quite interesting that these organizations, the one that turned out to be the most interested in general to this type of strategy. There are not other particular difference about social movements. If you will look specifically at social movement, the pattern of social movement organization is similar to the one that I was just highlighting, with 1991, 2008 organizations the most involved. And it is true, on the other hand, that for civil society organizations, the ones established before 91 were significantly less interested than the others. So there might be, in this sense, something that brings together the different the organizational types, so to speak. If we think of the transformation of organizational patterns, what can we say about that? I'm going fast because we are really... Well, again, overall, the levels of bureaucratic formalization were very low, in any case. Formalization was negatively correlated with the period of foundation. It was tended to be lower among the most recent organization, but in itself, yet again, that's not a great something surprising. Likewise, and here there are some interesting patterns, because generally speaking, civil society organizations were less formalized the more recent their establishment, which again, no, that's not a problem, but what is interesting in relation to the activist organization was that there were significantly, the differences were significantly between them and the more standard civil society groups, were significant both before and after 2008. Whereas they were more formalized and closer to civil society organizations in the period 1991-2008. So that's as if that kind of organization established in that phase, which was again a phase of growth of a new social movement kind types, might have somehow managed to secure, to develop a different style of action, which was not shared by organizations of the old, let's say it's called the old generation born before 91, which had been more, at least in this regard, closer to the standard pattern of this participatory group. So what is worth noting here is that further there is not necessarily a pattern of decreasing formalization the closer we get to the period in which data were collected. This was the case with the civil society groups, but not this one. The old activist groups were actually less formalized than more recent ones. There was a different emphasis on, again, here we're talking about the level, the extent to which these organizations were involved in public assemblies or in other types of neighborhood deliberative structures by phase, and this certainly, for example, this is the general pattern. They were, yes, there was clearly a rise in the interest of these, of generally speaking, of these groups into this type of more participatory practices. However, again, the pattern was, and in this regard, so there is a growth, but there is no sign of a particularly approximate growing proximity, so to speak, of civil society and social movement organization, because you can see, okay, yeah, there is a raise in the attention that even civil society groups pay to deliberative structures and participatory democratic practices, but the extent of involvement is extremely limited. It is much more pronounced instead for social movement organization. There, yes, we have a point. So yet again, differences are more pronounced. Very, very little evidence of growing proximity between these two types. The famous is a complicated story, because there were, I mean, I wouldn't waste your time trying to identify, count how these frames, styles were built, because it implied bringing together different and then finding, exploring correlation between different items which were in the data collection frameworks, but what we could identify, let's say, different a few themes, a few topics, which might be linked, I would say, to, on the one hand, collective emphasis on collective democratic empowerment and emphasis on equality, rights, and inclusion, namely more political topics, and attention to prefigurative action and in defense of the commons, there will be, another element. Another element would be the stress on the importance of fostering bottom-up solidarity, and another element, still another element, would be the presence or absence of teams more explicitly directly addressing the issue of the distribution of political power and the need to seize political power. Again, let's see. For example, what we see here is that in Italy there was this political element was much stronger among Italian organizations than elsewhere. There was an element of relative growth of this element of this particular theme among recently found established organizations, and the way in which it combines in different. There was no variation at this level, take into account a fairly low level of interest among civil society organizations, and there was instead, yet again, no particular. There was some slight variation, but not particularly massive, certainly. And among organizations, I thought I had switched off the phone, and there was again more a kind of curvilinear relation in attention paid to this topic among social movement organizations. But let's try to get a general. This type of element was strong in Spain and was very, very weak in comparative terms in Italy. That's important. And yet again, very little. There was little attention for this among standard civil society groups. It was much higher among social organizations, but not the ones established in the intermediate phase, 1991-2008, which were incidentally the one more interested instead in alternative lifestyles. Quality rights was much less pronounced. But let's go straight to the final summary. Sorry about that. It's not going ahead. Why? I'm stuck. Don't know what's happening. Okay. Take your time.
Shall I help out? There you go. There you go.
Now, generally speaking, again, the attention to themes like rights equality was not very high in general, but was highest in Greece and lowest in Italy. It was relatively high among old-style, long-established organizations, significantly low among the most recent groups. So it was not a distinctive feature of this of the recent one, and yet again, largely different patterns. Civil society groups even less interested than normal, and social movement organization quite stable in this low level of interest. I'll go straight at the end of the, again, if I can go better now. I don't know, sorry about that, but it's not. Okay, yet again, when it comes to prefigurative action, we've seen the appeal grows after 91, but it slows down, and this is comparable to what we saw when we were talking about the importance of alternative lifestyle practices, and that's consistent. But yet again, civil society and social movement organization has a very different path. Bottom-up solidarity was expressed. The interest in bottom-up solidarity was quite high, normally speaking. Let's see how this distributes. Now, again, there was, at this level, there was some element of attention among most recent civil society groups. Social movement organizations, generally speaking, were highly interested, no matter their foundation phase. So, and Italian groups, for some reason, were particularly keen on this conception of solidarity. But and finally, regarding political teams, generally speaking, there was very little attention for explicit political issues. In Italy, it was higher. In Greece, particularly high in Spain. And by phase, there was no particular sign of any kind of change for different organizations. What was quite remarkable was, however, the fact that, okay, there were really differences between the two types of organization had grown among the most recent of groups. But again, organizations in the established between 91 and 2000 and 2008 were actually the ones in which the differences were most limited. This brings us to the general conclusions of and I accept that it might have been difficult for you to follow the different passages. So my attempt to summarize it, as I said, it's a work in progress. We really need to straighten it up. But I would say, first of all, in terms of protest, the differences are highest among old organizations and minimal among those established in 91, 2008, not the most recent one. Even among the most recent groups, differences between civil society and SMOs persist. And these are the key, the first set of points. Pressure was minimal, and there was an homogenization, but simply because the level, as I said, of attention into political lobbying became so low for both types of organizations, as if, generally speaking, organizations of any sort were somehow detaching from any attempt to affect traditional politics to traditional means and conventional means. There were some signs of growing homogenization in the diffusion of the attention for lifestyle repertoires, but as I said, this tendency, this feature was most visible among organizations established before the crisis rather than after the crisis. In particular, what we call the new social movement phase, 91 to 2008. That was and see, in this sense, Donatella's argument about the growing proximity seemed to fit best the groups between 91, 2008, and rather than the most recent one. Regarding in terms of formalization, it was generally speaking low. There seems to be some point. In particular, social movement organizations were less formalized than traditional ones among the oldest and the most recent ones, but they were, if anything, more formalized even more formalized or similarly formalized to civil society groups for those, again, established in the 91, 2008. In terms of popular assemblies, the big gap persisted. And finally, regarding frames, there was no signs when it came to a political frame like collective empowerment that civil society groups were getting more similar to social movement ones. There was less relevance, ultimately between for this type of particular frame, equality, rights, and inclusion among younger civil society groups, but differences that didn't seem to be similar, particularly relevant in relation to the gap between support gap between social movement and civil society groups. So there will be in favors. Also, the idea of prefigurative commons showed some greater convergence among the most recent groups, but differences remain largely similar. And the same applies to the idea of solidarity from below. In comparative terms, what really came out was that Italy was the outlier in relation to the other two countries. There was a smaller presence of activist groups in the post 2008 cohorts. Generally speaking, there was the lowest interest in protest and in political repertoires, both protest and pressure, also in political teams. There was the highest interest in lifestyle practices. Very low interest, again, coherent with the low attention to political repertoire, very low interest in grassroots forms of democratic participation, and lower interest in the collective empowerment, equality, rights, inclusion frames, which are, again, the ones closest to the political. It was closer, high interest, but they also apply to Greece in prefigurative commons and also in the notion of solidarity from below. The question is, at this point, however, rather than clearly, this seems to me the attention, the evidence so far is not conclusive regarding whether younger organizations tend to be more similar regarding their starting point, their focus across the divide, civil society groups and activist groups. There is very partial evidence. What seems to me the strongest point, which stands out, as I said, is the difference between Italy and the rest, and the rest of the lot. I mean, the other two countries. And I wonder at this point the extent to which it was the relative affluence of Italy by comparison to Spain and Greece, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, the relatively minor intensity of the crisis, if that might not be actually the main obvious structural feature behind these differences and the inclination of groups to adopt different strategies, rather than, let's say, reflecting any kind of general trend towards a closer similarity between different types of organizations active in the collective action field. So this would be I think that there is an element to be explored relating to differences between countries in order to get a more nuanced understanding of why how difficult it is to identify similarity and differences between different organizational types. And I think I can stop here. Thanks for your patience. It took me longer than, well, no, okay. Sorry for taking so long. It was a complex set of data, and thanks for your attention. I think I can.
Thank you, Mari. Thank you, Mari.
I can get out of the. Okay.
Wait a minute.
Thank you very much, Mari.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Well, I'm going to be doing the commentary. Well, thank you, of course. This is an extremely rich presentation. I think a very important topic with quite complex data, of course, and a thought-provoking presentation. I hope I can do justice to it. In the commentary, allow me to pick up where I left off in the introduction. The point, I mean, where I refer to our common anxiety against concept stretching. The idea, in other words, that especially in times of crisis, we shouldn't just be counting things. We should always be making sure that we know what we're counting. And listening to Mario, I think that this is precisely what you're doing with the live what data, Maria Kousis's data, because you take a very popular, maybe a seductive idea about this idea that social movements and civil society organizations are converging, and you are subjecting it to a very meticulous stress test. So you don't just accept the easy, shall I call it, definition. You look under the hood. And even if you don't stress that in the presentation, as I think you must have more, I think that your concerns are primarily conceptual. Now, having said that, I want to engage with some of the findings by employing a complementary perspective that comes from work that we did here in the laboratory, a paper I did jointly with Lucia Kotronaki back in 2020. And for those of you who are interested in the Greek version, there's a video of that on our YouTube channel from January 2021. Time flies, right? 5 years ago. And the idea, my idea for the commentary is to see if we can interpret at least some of Mario's findings and perhaps some of his puzzles through our own slightly different theoretical vocabulary. Well, let's start off with Mario's story, the story that he just told us. So that considering that the dominant narrative, I think, in the field is indeed the convergence hypothesis, as formulated by Donatella, whereby social movement organizations are becoming more like NGOs, more formal, more professional, and so on. And civil society organizations are becoming more radical, more protest-oriented. The argument has been that the boundaries are blurring and that we're all becoming alternative action organizations. So we have to operate with this concept. But the data that Mario presented tells a far more complicated story. And this is precisely where it gets fascinating, I think. Because it shows that while this convergence is indeed largely happening in older cohorts, correct? Among groups, in other words, emerging in the 90s and 2000. It breaks down, actually, when we look at organizations born after 2008. And the imagery being that whereas new civil society organizations are not protesting more, in fact, I think that findings show that they tend to be protesting less. New social movement organizations, I mean, organizations founded after 2008, are retaining a very distinct conflictual character, especially in Greece and Spain. And the question, of course, is why, right? I mean, why does the convergence model fail to explain the children of the crisis, to use that expression, as we may call the younger cohort? And I think the answer is very simple. It is that the crisis not only did not bring these two worlds together, civil society organizations and social movement organizations, in fact, it tore them apart. And this is where I think it makes sense to employ some of our own vocabulary, that theme I mentioned before, where we're experimenting with a different organization of that universe, which leads to an altogether different typology. And what we do is that instead of looking just at the form, external features, we're trying to organize this universe on the basis of two fundamentally different types of political logic. We're looking at the underlying political logic. And there we find two types, basically two types in a hybrid third, which are actually antagonistic, if not outright inimical to each other. We call them resilience and heterotopy. And let me try to explain, if I can, how this, I think, maps onto Mario's data. Mario noted that many post-2008 civil society organizations show low levels of protest, right? Which at first may appear to be a puzzle. If society is collapsing, why aren't civic associations in the streets, right? It's a valid question. And to that, our answer would be because they are trapped in what we call the logic of resilience. In the Greek context, and I rush to add not only in the Greek context, this resilience isn't just a psychological trait, it's a political program deep down. It is a multitude of NGOs and social enterprises, between inverted commas, that popped up to, shall I say, manage the crisis. And they are typically funded by the EU or the state via vouchers for soup kitchens and whatever, so on. And their task is not to challenge the causes of poverty, but just to help people cope with poverty. So the fact that they don't score high on the protest variables should hardly come as a surprise. It would be like biting the hand that feeds them. They do, of course, adopt a language of empowerment, even at times offering alternatives to dominant modes of social reproduction, but they do that discursively. They say that, but what they really do is that they engage in accommodation. You may call it neoliberal accommodation. Because think of it, what they do is that they're doing the state's job for the state, in reality. And the real point I want to make in this connection is that when we see low protest in these new civil society organizations, we don't see apathy as an aberration. We see normal functioning. Like we see them performing the function for which they were created as structures. On the other hand, now, the groups we have in Greece and Spain that score high on collective empowerment and political themes, we call this phenomenon heterotopy, borrowing from Foucault, but making it more political. And here we have in mind the squats, self-organized clinics, in a phrase, structural solidarities, structures of solidarities from below, basically, with specific political content. Now, these groups reject funding, they reject hierarchy, And in terms of the content of the political discourse, they don't want to fix the system. They want to build a counter place. That's how we call. That's why we call it heterotopy. A place where capitalist social relations are overturned in one way or another, of course. Now, this may also help explain the findings about the political themes you mentioned. Because you notice that political framing is much more intense in Greece and Spain than in Italy, if I'm correct. And of course, my sense is not just not national culture. It is a reflection of how the crisis was experienced. And of course, in Italy, it was not experienced as severely as you mentioned. But in Greece and Spain, the depth of the crisis was such that it meant you couldn't just be a neutral volunteer. You had to take side. Uh, you were either going to be filling out forms for a grant, the resilience type, or you were occupying empty buildings to house refugees, the heterotopy type. And let me rush to add that the fact that Italy followed a different trajectory, which does demand a special explanation, I think. I guess obviously that it has to do with the fact that Italy wasn't suffering so much from the crisis, but still there's more work to be done in order to offer a robust explanation. All this, of course, brings me back to the conceptual issue. And I'm referring to the AAOs, the Alternative Action Organizations, which groups all these actors together. Well, I think that the AAOs is a very useful umbrella as it helps us group the data and amass it in the first place. But my concern is that, is it enough? Shouldn't be doing more conceptual in order to organize. Because if we put a resilience type NGO, which manages poverty, and the heterotopy squad, which sets out to fight against the roots of poverty in the same category as AAOs, because they're both AAOs, are we not perhaps falling into the trap of the pseudo categories? Because even though on paper they may look similar, because they both distribute food, they both talk about solidarity, they both use volunteer work. Their function, as I said before, is not really different. In fact, it's opposite. One stabilizes the system, the other tries to undermine it. Now, be that as it may, and I want your reaction to this observation. What is indisputable is that the crisis generation appears to be split. In my understanding, you may even say this grand phrase that politics is back. In the sense that, I don't know if you agree, but the civil society paradigm of the 90s, like this idea that we can all just work together for the common good in society, sort of toppling dictatorships in the Southern Europe and in the Southern Cone and so on. This idea is gone. And perhaps the crisis is that killed it. And in its place, we have a far more polarized and politicized field. We have the technocrats of civil society, and I think it's challenged to conceptualize these people, the technocrats of civil society, professionalized, distinct, non-protesting. And we also have what we may call the heterotopic partisans of solidarity, to coin an expression, like politicized, informal, contentious, highly contentious. And before I stop, because I don't want to go on mumbling, I also want to comment briefly on the presentation's findings about lifestyle politics and framing, which I also found fascinating, even though you didn't spend much time on it. But I have the PowerPoint. I don't have the paper, but I have the PowerPoint, so I had time to look at the data. I believe that it was mentioned that equality and rights as frames are losing grounds among newer groups, right? While collective empowerment is rising. And I think that fits perfectly with the heterotopy argument, because the language of rights is a language you speak, you address to the state. You ask the state to give you rights, right? But when the state collapses or becomes an adversary, when you know that there's no point in talking to the state, as it happened in Greece, and it continues to happen as we speak, you stop asking for rights, you start building power. So this collective empowerment, in that sense, sounds like the language of people who have realized that no one is coming to save them. Hence, they have to do the job themselves. On the other hand, when we see a decline in rights talk, it may not mean that these groups care less about justice or similar themes. Maybe it means that they have lost faith in the liberal mechanism of demanding justice. This is particularly acute in Greece as we speak. Or that in general, more generally speaking, they're moving from claiming to enacting, which fits into the prefigurative theme in general. Well, to wrap up, this is a very interesting presentation, more interesting than it sounds in terms of the questions it raises. I think it's a master class in how to handle data responsibly. Not by forcing data to fit the theory, but by letting it guide you into asking key questions. When we do that, as of course we always must do that, we may well end up with perplexing questions, untidy conclusions. And this in part is the case with your presentation. But my suggestion is that this perplexing post-2008 cohort may actually be a sign of political clarity. Someone may sort of draw these conclusions in the sense that the convergence hypothesis assumes a middle ground, but your presentation has shown the crisis has destroyed the middle ground, right? I mean, it has tended to force actors to choose among two patterns. Should they become professional, safe, perhaps well-funded as well, or rather become radical, precarious, and dangerous? The charts we've seen show that the organizations in Europe are making these choices right now as we speak. This is why the presentation is very important. And perhaps the outliers, as you said, in the data, the Greek and Spanish groups that refuse to behave like proper NGOs, like sort of are the test cases of this divergence, really, rather than convergence. Maybe they're not the exception, maybe they are the future. So which is a big theoretical sort of offshoot of the data. Well, that's all I have to say. Once again, I want to thank Mario for giving us such solid empirical foundation to work with. And now I want to open the floor open to further discussion. Thank you, and Maria, you have the floor. To turn on the right.
Thank you very much. I also want to express my deep gratitude to Mario for bringing a big, strong light on this data set, and for doing such an exhaustive analysis to test Donatella's hybridization theory. And some of the findings, well, first, I want to say how well the categories were grouped. Everything was done with all, taking into account all the different sensitivities of the data that we've had in the project. And many interesting things now are seen. I really like, Mario, the way that you have created these 4 categories: protest, communication, pressure, and alternative lifestyles. And the question you had at the end, for me, do the levels of affluence and or severity have affected the action? I agree with what you said. Yes, I think absolutely they do. Based on the many different analyses we have done with a 9-year data set, it has repeatedly come, the finding has been shown. So I would agree with you on that one. Now, on the specific questions, I must say I need to check, with being more careful with all the different tables. I didn't have the latest PowerPoint. I want to say just a few more things. You mentioned in the presentation that we took one point, we called it the websites of 500 organizations, formal or informal, for each country, at the specific time that we were doing the coding. So that was a good point, because I think if we were able to recode, to follow these organizations, say, another 5 or 6 years, we would see some changes in these new organizations, which I don't know where they would, take the results, but it would be great if we had a longer timeline with this data. And I say this because, for example, in 2016, we had the foundation of a ministry for social and solidarity economy. I have no data, but it would make an interesting question, to test Donatella's hybridization theory and see if this institutionalization in 2016 had any effect on these SMOs. And I think it would be interesting. And also, from Angelos Lourgakis' dissertation, we know that at the end of that recent, post 2008 period, the number of the smaller groups were decreasing considerably. Now, I have to mention at this point that when we did this, and I understand the points that Serafim has made, we actually started with the solidarity activities. For each country, we had lists of solidarity activities, and based on those, we identified hubs or independent websites to include in our universe of websites, and then randomly sample 500 from this. If you remember, in Greece, Enallactikos in 2013 had about more than 3,000 groups. Of course, we cleaned those groups. We had made sure that we didn't have state-funded or privately funded, like some big privately funded companies had solidarity groups at that time. So we tried to keep, as Serafim said, as close to our conceptual umbrella as possible. But when you had 9 countries with very different crisis experiences, this led to the creation of the alternative action organizations, which meant we were outside of the market economy, and we were not state funded. So this, I would still consider Donatella's proposal for the hybridization, because when we start with the solidarity activities, that means that we are interested in a specific point in time when, for Greece at least, we had very dissimilar groups getting together to protest, to provide, very dissimilar groups. So maybe if we examine only one aspect, as you clearly showed that the alternative lifestyles that were much stronger in Italy, and as you said, there was the Genova effect, the anti-globalization movement effect. If we take maybe one stream of this, then it will be easier. But we would need a longer time frame for this, and it's not an easy thing to do. Also, as you said, across different countries because of the experience, and I absolutely agree with you on that. Greece was leaving the, we all know this, it had the most severe impact. So it's not a surprise to see it with this analysis. Thank you so much, Mario. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Maria. Somebody else wants to come into the discussion? You're thinking about it?
Me?
It takes a lot to digest all this data, Mario. So maybe.
Well, it takes a lot. I think the comments were by far the most interesting part of the best part of the talk. Of the meeting. You gave excellent comments and highlighting different aspects of both the data and the interpretation. As I said, it's for me. I'm very grateful for these comments, and I think they're very useful. And I think yeah. There is a double element here, and it's really a preliminary, as I said, it's a preliminary stage of reflection, and it's important to find a way to combine in the discussion these two. There is a double comparative element. There is the element across country, and there is also the element across temporal phases to some extent, at least. And I think this double element needs to be. I think it's the focus of any kind of sound interpretation of this data, because when on the one hand, I'm still intrigued by the fact that the patterns there. Once you go through the data again and see, but there are many patterns which are where Italy relatively stands out, and so I know that we know perfectly that now the strategy of comparing countries and associated the features of collective action to different countries is out of date. I mean, it's not an exercise that is so popular right now. And also for good reasons. There is a complexity within each country that it's difficult to. It speaks against simply making some general inferences, simply comparing countries assumed to be as a whole a coherent entity with each other. But at the same time, I think the data is something we need to be technical to maintain. Italy experienced different levels of crisis, as you said. And the other element is precisely the phases. And there is more, I think it's real. I suspect also I think at the end of the day, the important thing is not so much to test Donatella's theory as such. I don't think she wasn't. Her piece was not referring to any particular country. It was a much more general kind of theoretical argument meant to stimulate analysis rather than drawing generalization. So it's not a point of testing it empirically in a systematic way, but just as a stimulus to think and try to make sense of what we're seeing at that particular time. I think the phase in which it's important to elaborate more about and develop, I think, a convincing argument about the importance of the phase. 91. Okay, now you could pick another specific here, but it's not the point. To say the 90s were the years in which there was this, as you said, there was a idea of civil society winning. The Berlin Wall had fallen, the Soviet Union had collapsed. That 91 is
the resurrection of civil society. It was
exactly.
The resurrection of civil society.
No, exactly. That brought
Hooray!
Exactly, and that both created expectations and also created spread the idea that certain forms of organization, growing professionalization of groups, etc., were dominant, were to be the dominant pattern. There would be an endless attention from the openness from the EU and other political institutions to encourage this trend, to respond to it. It was all set of expectations and assumptions about the way collective action, even the civil society and collective action would develop. And that's I think even more possibly even more important than the comparison across countries. So I think the task ahead is to try to find the balance between these two elements. How this, because the civil society argument was worldwide, was widespread. So there was a common element that affected, I think, at least in principle, organizations established in different countries. And then there is the peculiarity of the crisis that strikes, and defines different patterns of evolution. I very much, yeah, I think it's a very good point what you said regarding the fact that, yeah, the crisis didn't bring civil society together; it tore it apart, and it's at least, and also to some, it should be interesting to explore it in the terms of the relational patterns between these groups. We don't have the data for that, unfortunately. But even in terms of the characteristics, this might be something worth looking into, definitely in a deeper way when we revise this data. So thank you.
But my overall concern is that it would draw the conclusion that there's no convergence, which cannot be supported. The question is, are we perhaps having two different animals within the universe of solidarity associations? And if we do, we need different concepts to address them and ask different questions. Because the questions that are relevant for one group are irrelevant for the other. For example, why doesn't an NGO protest? Because it gets funds from the state. That's why it doesn't protest. The question is not relevant. So you need new concepts. That's the whole idea. That's my concern.
Yeah, but this is not. But my only problem with that is that it is not so widespread.
Okay.
It's not necessarily. It also stems from the way different organizations decide to try to negotiate and walk, so to speak, walk a very thin line, trying to build to find a balance, because that's exactly what they found in for example, in the study that you mentioned in Britain. In Britain, what we found was that yes, the institutional context was the same. It was a clear pattern. It encouraged the organizations to relate for their funding to the government, and thus reducing, in principle, their increasing, the constraint posed on them by the fact of being relying increasingly on public money. But at the same time, organizations with similar profile would get involved in protest campaigns at a different level. What I'm saying, what are the relational patterns that I associated with the social movements more directly did not include only organizations with a very limited, only with a strong radical approach, or with a very limited level of formalization. They included more complex set of actors. So, and in this sense, it's also interesting to see to what extent actors which have a different organizational focus, which have a different mission, which have developed organizational structures suited to the main goal, whether they all relate in the same exact way to repertoires that are not central to their say, core mission, so to speak. But and so there is space for this mechanism of adaptation. The crisis was a big stimulus, big occasion. I mean, big stimulus to big shock, altering and this generated the responses from different organizations. These responses were different in emphasis, sure, but the question is, can we assume that they were all entirely shaped by the profile these organizations had to start?
This is a big question.
No, exactly. But
they have similarities.
No, exactly. But this is what Taro pointed out when he was doing the cycle of contention in Italy, or what McAdam found, and the others, or Aldo Morris, when we were looking at the civil rights movement. They said, yes, there were some of the usual suspects, but there were also organizations which are, for example, churches, religious groups, which may not have been particularly radical in the first place, that adopted different strategies on the content. So I think it's intriguing. I mean,
Maria,
I take your point, but I think...
Maria wants to say something.
Oh, yes, sure.
I just wanted to say that I found very useful when I did some of my work, the classification that Chuck Tilley gives on the forms of movements, the professional, the community-oriented, and the communitarian, because, well, Mario is a huge expert on the environmental movement, but you see, I mean, it helped me make sense of the environmental movement in these three different forms, because they are all aiming towards environmental protection and amelioration, but they do it with different repertoires. Only Greenpeace does some symbolic protests, for example. But Friends of the Earth has been taking strong stance, for example, now on artificial intelligence, or previously with biotechnology. Some of these NGOs, of course, they get these big funders, and we we know this from our research. But if we leave these big organizations which have a very different type of aim and means to achieve it, mostly related to legal, to creation of laws, protection, etc., compared to the radical groups which are underground and have, the frame of a completely new community, which will hit animal labs, etc. So I understand the points that are raised, but I have to close this now. That's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Anyway, thank you, Maria. Anyway, there are different ways to organize different universes. I mean, you divide up things by gender, by income group, by place of birth, year birth, age, and so on. The question is, which sort of way of organizing universes is more theoretically useful? I mean, helping us to raise pertinent questions, which is a big challenge for all of us. Well, if there's nothing more you want to add, thank you again very much all for participating. The video will be available shortly, so we can go back to the discussion and figure out more things about the nature of the findings. Thank you all. See you soon and stay in touch.
Thank you very much.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Maria.